From St. Petersburg
and Brooklyn.
This is She's in Russia. I'm Lily.
And I'm Smith.
Today's episode is about our trip down to the Bryansky forest to visit a woman named Laura Williams, who, among many, many other things, loved horses and worked as an equine-assisted learning facilitator. She helped a lot of people through a lot of different kinds of physical and mental, emotional trauma through spending time with horses. So in a very shocking and unexpected twist of fate, Laura died today, October 28th, in a riding accident during a training session. And we just learned about this horrible news a few hours ago, and we're still kind of processing it, trying to wrap our heads around it. I'm sorry, my voice is shaky. So we just spent a few days with this really energetic, open person who welcomed us into her home last month. And it might sound cheesy, but it's hard to find words, and words sound empty. But for me personally, I felt like the things that I learned about Laura and her life, some of the choices that she made struck me as very bold and brave. And I really enjoy thinking about and finding these little parallel moments in our lives, because I'm also a young Amerikanka. I didn't mention that. She's American, who moved to Russia and chose to stay in Russia. Though mostly when I compare our lives, I see how different our choices were. So Smith and I recorded a bunch of audio with Laura and her horses and her forest friends while we were there. And Smith has been spending time going through all of this audio since then to put together this episode. It's completely by chance that we happen to be recording this episode on the day of Laura's passing. But given that is the case, we would like to dedicate this episode to Laura and to her work, and just to say that our thoughts are with Laura's family, with her husband and 2 sons, and all of the many, many loved ones who are experiencing the pain of her passing right now.
Yeah. We're also keeping the story in present tense, like Laura's life in present tense. I think because for both of us, at least for me, it seems like too soon and too sudden to make the switch to past tense.
Yeah.
So we arrive in Bryansk early Friday morning, and the person Laura has sent to pick us up, Sasha, meets us on the platform. We've taken an overnight train from Moscow, and because they were cheap, we've gotten coupe tickets. Usually the cheapest tickets are in the Platzkart, where along one side of the train are essentially bunk beds running parallel to the wall, and along the other side are small alcoves with 2 bunk beds perpendicular to the wall, and a table for tea and food and other snacks. And the Platzkart is tight and smells like people, and you have to make your bed with the provided starched sheets. And the coupe is basically one of these alcoves with 4 beds, but with a door, and your bed is made for you, and everything is not so cramped. And on certain trains, you get breakfast and slippers and a toothbrush. You're still with strangers, though, unless I guess you have a party of 4. We share our coupe with 2 men, maybe just friends, though they acted more like brothers and look a lot alike. Both are in their early 40s and meaty and from Bryansk, and they stepped out of the coupe a lot so that we could change, though we never did.
Yeah, these guys are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, just 2 regular pals, kind of the type of people I imagine Chekhov would base a short story on. He'd take an overnight train and then just word for word write down the exact dialogue of his random travel companions, and then like publish it in a short story, and everyone would be like, oh wow, he writes like the voice of the people. How does he do that? How does he manage to portray it so accurately? In the morning, in the train car, the neighbor under my bunk, because Smith and I were both on top bunks, wakes me up with the sound of him blowing his nose, very horn-like and repeatedly. Do you have to blow your nose so loud? His friend asks him. As a matter of fact, I do. He retorts in that tone of voice you use with a person you're used to squabbling with. Can't stay clogged up now, can I? The night before, right before the 2 guys said goodnight to each other and to us, Smith's bunkmate said, if I snore, just yell at me and I'll stop. I said, okay. My bunkmate said, If I snore, I snore. A little later, when we'd all said goodnight, my bunkmate started snoring, and Smith's bunkmate kind of pushed him a little bit, and he rolled over onto his side and stopped. See, I'm Chekhov.
Bryansk is in southern Russia near the Ukrainian border and about 400 kilometers southwest of Moscow. We've come here for a certain American, Laura Williams, who lives in a small village in the Bryansk forest right near the Bryansk Nature Reserve. The trees of the Bryansk forest are young, cut down and replanted throughout history. Most look young with narrow trunks, not too tall. But the forest's history, the land, is old. People lived in the forest as far back as the Neolithic era. And since the late 90s, Laura has been living a forest life there. Laura is an equine-assisted learning facilitator, or what is often, though maybe incorrectly, called a horse therapist.
So just really quickly to sum that up, that's why there's equine-assisted psychotherapy, which is with a psychotherapist or psychologist. And those who don't have a psychological degree are equine-assisted learning practitioners. So it's a mouthful. I mean, that's why I've just come to equine-guided life coach, or in Russian, it's completely different. In Russian, since we're not even, there's nothing close to that even in the language, I just call it Guide to the World of Horses.
We interviewed Laura at the end of our time in the region, but we're going to play parts of that interview throughout.
Yeah, maybe get into a little bit about the principles, but also if you could also just weave in how you found out about it or something real quick. Yeah.
Okay. So, that's just the terminology is complicated enough when you actually try to figure out what it is and what it's about. As you know, it's very experiential, right? You have to sort of be there to really understand it and to feel it. So it's really hard to explain to people what we do. And the closest sort of analogy is really observing horses and the way that they are able to live in the here and now, the way that they are able to live in a herd as social creatures and interact with each other in relationship, the way that emotions are given outlets, they're given flow, they're not held onto inside, and then expressed, and then the herd goes back to grazing. So modeling that, modeling being present, and as I talked about in our session, having all your layers be as one. So being able to know what's going on in your body, what's your emotions, or what's going on outside that's maybe being projected on you, and understanding, is this mine or is this something else? So being really present and aware of the information in your body, and being really present and aware of your senses and what's going on around, is what the horses teach us, because they are always tuned in to the information that's coming from within and the information that's coming from without. And one of the things that they teach us is, we don't need to be afraid of emotions or feelings. It's just information. It's information. And so when we get that understanding, we can think about, well, what is that information trying to tell me? Or what is it that I'm trying to do? But if we're ignoring that information, we're ignoring those feelings, then often issues can lie under the surface for an extended period of time and really do a disservice to us until we're able to express them. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, what the horses model for us. And then the reason the work is so powerful, as you've experienced in these past 2 days, is because it really gives people a new experience. And, you have some horse experience, but a lot of people have absolutely no horse experience. So sometimes for them, it's really going out of their comfort zone and, trying to create a relationship or a language with another creature that you don't speak the languages. So it's really at a level of energy of what energy am I expressing by, doing what I do. And in a way, the horse is like holding up a mirror to you and saying, well, this is what you look like to me. And so having that learning and that knowledge, you might then go back into your life and be like, wow, I really do come across really heavily or hard-handed, or no wonder, people sort of cringe when I come. Or the other way, you might discover that your boundaries are really loose and really open. And so maybe there's things in your life that don't feel comfortable to you because your boundaries are too open. You're being abused, or you're being walked all over, or, your boss is getting the best of you, or whatever it is in your life, sometimes we can only see that from this, from another point of view when we're with the horses, and again, with a good facilitator that can help us to bring that learning out.
I think it's not necessarily obvious for people that this doesn't involve like coming out to a horse and then riding it, because that's like for me at least, the default interaction with horses is, like love and respect and care, but then you also ride horses in my experience with horses. And even when people were asking me, when I was telling them about this trip to come down and see you, like, what are you going to be doing there? I wasn't sure if I really wasn't sure how the interaction would be, like what we would be doing. And so I think it was really like, that was the biggest sort of thing for me, was being able to interact with horses like only with my feet on the ground.
Well, and that's for a reason, because what really interests me as a facilitator is the horses naturally expressing themselves. So, and it's unsafe for a horse to express himself naturally if he's got a rider on it. Because if he's uncomfortable or he doesn't like something and he bucks and kicks, obviously the rider could get hurt, or if he takes off. Whereas when you're working on the ground with horses, and particularly as we do with my herd, we do most of our work at Liberty, so they have the choice to come up and connect with the client or not. You're really getting a lot of natural feedback that, if you were in the controlling or the dominant situation, which you would be traditionally, the way horses are controlled when you are riding them, you wouldn't get this really valuable natural feedback. And it's not like, I've found that my horses are really growing into this role. Like, since, the ones that say were traditionally, used in the sort of I-it type of relationship as farm tools or as riding machines or breeding machines or whatever, it took them some time to open up and be able to express themselves and understand that I really wanted to hear their expression, their natural expression, and that they were welcome to do that. So it was a process of really just letting them be and letting them express themselves. And then, as you saw today, they so willingly come up and step up, and very clearly step up to do the work when they've been let make that choice.
Laura told us via email that Sasha would wait for us on the platform, that he is about 40, not tall, with short hair and glasses, usually wears a green hoodie that says Bryansky less, which means Bryansk Forest. Sasha was waiting for us not in a green hoodie, but in a red polo with an English football team insignia. Maybe Manchester, but better not to guess with these things. For the 2-hour drive, I sat in the passenger seat and Lily sat in the back chatting with Sasha in Russian and translating now and again what they were saying. When they spoke Russian, sometimes I listened and sometimes I looked out the window. Sasha keeps up a running commentary.
Вот здесь село слева, Хацунь называется. Во время войны немцы 300 мирных жителей расстреляли. Здесь памятник им стоит.
We pass a village, a silo, and he says during the war the Nazis rounded up everyone in this village, about 300 people, and shot them. There's a memorial there. In Suzemka there's also a memorial. It's a town not far outside of Bryansky Forest. 400 people were killed there. Everyone was killed, women, children, old people. After the war, the villages like that were empty, but people came and settled there. Relatives of the people who died and others came to the village to rebuild it and live.
Это памятник автомобилистам. Вот. Все сигналят им. Это вот автомобили мы проехали.
Some cars honk, Sasha honks. He tells us that the place they're honking at is a specific spot on the highway, a memorial commemorating military drivers in the war. He says it's the only one of its kind. The tradition is that you honk as you pass it.
I note the trees, some kind of evergreen pine with peeling bark that gets lighter as you go up. I asked Lily, what kind of pine trees are these? And Lily asked Sasha, Это sosna? Are these pine? Sasha says, da, sosna. They're pine, she tells me. Sosna, I say. Yeah, sosna.
Практически Русь так она из сел-то и произошла.
Sasha tells us how Russia grew out of the silos of Rus. They got bigger and bigger and eventually formed cities. But some silos stayed silos.
Заповедник, Брянский лес. Это корочайший путь показан сюда. Так-то можно и заехать и через Суземку сюда.
Oh yeah, nature reserve. We turn into a smaller dirt road next to a sign that says Nature Reserve Bryansky Les. It's not actually the reserve, but we're close, in the so-called buffer zone that surrounds it. In the woods, there are small, preserved structures from the partisans. The partisans in the Bryansk region were a militia who fought the Nazis both in a guerrilla war that defended Russian territory behind German lines and combated German propaganda. Sasha says to ask Laura about the partisans. She knows about the partisans, he says. We do ask Laura about the partisans, but we also ask her about the history of the forest as a whole.
Could you talk a little bit about the forest itself and maybe the history of it, how you learned the history of it maybe is interesting to me because you've spent now a long time in it, basically, right near it.
Well, that's, if you just look at it geographically, the forest is a giant sort of strip of coniferous, mostly pine forest, stretching from the Kaluga region, which is just north towards Moscow of us, through the Bryansk region and with its southern tip in the Ukraine. So it's this giant swath of intact forest, mostly intact. And everything around it, if you were to look at a picture from space, which we used to have hanging in the visitor center, you would see that everything around it, especially to the south, but also a little bit to the north, is agricultural lands that have mostly been developed. And the only reason this area hasn't been developed is because the forest grows on a moraine which was left by a glacier, which 10,000 years ago retreated and left mass amounts of sand, which aren't very fertile. So pine trees do fine in sand. And in areas that are enriched by the floodplain and by the rivers, you'll see other species like oaks and, aspen and linden and alder in the floodplains. But none of that's very good for agriculture. So historically, that's what saved this forest from being, completely cut down for timber was the fact that the agricultural lands really didn't serve any use for people. The forest, on the other hand, has been a savior for so many people. I mean, if we go back to, hundreds of years ago, 300 years ago, this village where we live, for example, was created. And the people who lived here, they lived off of what the forest gave them. So it might have been wooden barrels that they made and then sold at market. They would use like pieces of bark from trees to make lapti, which are like old, slippers, like the woven slippers that you might have seen. Which were what people wore as shoes. They would collect berries, mushrooms, hunt fish. So essentially they lived off what the forest provided. And back then it was sustainable because there weren't that many people and, they didn't have all the machinery and the heavy chainsaws and all those things. So it was all sort of very renewable. Whereas nowadays, most people aren't engaged in those. In fact, most of the people who knew how to make barrels or knew how to make wooden boats, they've died along with the knowledge, the craftsmanship that went with that. It's really hard to find people these days that know how to make a wagon wheel, for example. So nowadays, with agriculture and forestry becoming so mechanized, obviously humans can do a lot more damage. So it was really urgent to create this preserve before that could happen. But of course, there are parts of the forest that aren't preserved and they are logged. And you'll see when you drive through the forest, you see a lot of the forests are even planted. Like there's not that many old growth trees or really old forests here. A lot of them have been planted like after the war or during the war because areas were logged. And then replanted. So you'll see a lot of secondary forests here. And then during the war, the forest literally became like the home and the shelter for the partisans and their families. And, essentially the whole partisan movement, 60,000 partisans lived in the Bryansk forest during the war. And that was their home. And they built like underground bunkers that you couldn't see from above so that, the Germans couldn't, the Nazis couldn't bomb them, or they wouldn't know where to bomb them anyway. And that became their home for several years, was the forest and their hideaway. And the villages that were left in the forest, because they really wanted, they didn't want to be taken over by the Germans. They supported the partisans. So they would give them food, they would give them shelter if they needed that. Or some of them, like the men and the boys, they became, and a lot of the women too, became partisans themselves. And the trail, the partisan trail, in fact, if you leave at 4:00, this is an aside, if you leave at 4:00, you might actually be able to just quickly run through that little trail on the partisan trail. It's not very long, and I'm sure Sasha would wait. But you see a lot of stories there about the women who participated, who helped, whether they were nurses or they were radio operators or they were, fighting in battles. They played a huge role too. So, and without the forest, they wouldn't have been able to survive. It really became their protector. And so you'll see on that trail, they talk about how the trees witnessed so much trauma and during the war, and really were the protectors of the people who lived here.
Не знаю, туда заезжать.
Oh,
Может, ей не понравится, что я заеду туда, то я ее завожу туда.
We arrived at Laura's around 10 a.m.
Отведу. Здесь машины закрывать не обязательно.
Besides chickens and a trampoline that Smith immediately runs to and starts showing off her flips on, I was naturally very impressed. There's a big lawn, lots of field area, a garden with flowers and vegetables, a greenhouse with tomatoes, a banya house, a main house built of orangey red brick, and an old dilapidated house that Laura and her husband lived in before they built the big house made of brick. There's also a garage, above which is our room, an apple tree, a pond with a small dock, some barns, a corral, and the horses for therapy. Laura meets us out on the lawn. She's exactly how you would think an American woman who owns a bunch of horses and lives in the Russian wilderness would look. She has wavy shoulder-length, light reddish-brown hair, freckles, brown eyes, pretty and ageless. She's wearing jeans and an open flannel over a tank top, barefoot. A horse girl through and through. I tell Smith I thought she'd be older. I was imagining a crazy horse lady in the woods. Sasha greets her and says something concerned about the cold grass and bare feet. She brushes it off matter-of-factly in flowing Russian, with only a slight little accent left, saying, "It's fine, it's warm out." Later, when we ask Laura if there is something particular about the Russian relationship to horses, she answers in classic horse girl fashion.
I would just take it to humans, actually, of how humans have treated horses. Because, horses have been at our side for generations, right? Before the automobile, the horses were what allowed us to expand into new territory, to fight wars, to build things. Essentially, the horses were our partners in becoming civilized. And it was, thanks to the horses that we started to explore other cultures or trade or start to have an economy. Genghis Khan's entire clan, or what do they call them? Horde, came by horseback. So explorations of the American West, explorations of the Russian East, before there were trains, planes, and automobiles, it was all horses. So I think we have this enormous debt to these animals for having literally carried us on their backs since the beginning of time. Since we first learned to interact with them and have them help us. And if you look back at the times of the Russian emperors and the czars, horses were a huge part of their lives. You don't see a statue in Moscow of some either war hero or czar that doesn't involve a horse some way or another. And so they were a a symbol of power, and a symbol of strength and freedom and independence. So I think, in fact, if I get this wrong, my friend just told me this the other day, the word to manage in Russian, or in English, sorry, the word to manage comes from menagerie, which first came from where they kept horses in French. So, there's a lot of roots that we are today, because most of us are quite distant from horses, living the lifestyles that we do, that we don't acknowledge, that we don't feel. But the horses haven't forgot that. And I think even the horses that are like wild or semi-wild, there's some horses in the south of Russia, in the Rostov region, which are semi-wild, and they haven't had any interaction with humans. And some researchers have been studying them. And I asked a friend of mine who's a scientist down there, I said, because I've seen pictures of them coming up and being curious about and interacting with humans. And I said, these horses are wild. They don't have to come and interact with humans. Why do they? What draws them to it? It's not about the food or the scratching, because they don't feed them or anything. What is it about them? And she said something that really hit me, which, first of all, obviously horses are curious creatures, right? Which I know. But also because it's in their DNA to be alongside humans. I mean, we've bred a lot of these horses, a lot of the different breeds, selecting characteristics and qualities that we like, like them being not being too aggressive, and, being able to be in connection with people or whatever. So it's in their DNA that they're connected to humans. So it's in our DNA too.
We're tired and road-worn. We probably smell bad, but Laura understands what we need and immediately, easily transitions into a comforting mom-host mode. She says, put your things in your room, wash up if you want, change clothes, and come on into the house to eat.
For breakfast, Laura makes us buckwheat pancakes with pine nuts, local honey, and berries picked from the forest. They're delicious, of course. In our detailed itinerary that she sent us via email, there were several meals for which we were supposed to fend for ourselves, but Laura ends up cooking and feeding us every single meal we eat while at her house. Fresh vegetables from her garden, oatmeal, mushroom stuffed pork, eggs from the chickens, spaghetti squash whose seeds she brought from America and grew in her garden, kale too, scarce commodities in Russia. We learned about Laura from a journalist in Moscow who Lily went to the trash protests in Lubnya with back in April. The journalist asked Lily if she'd heard about the American woman who lives in the woods and is a horse therapist. Lily hadn't. She told me about this mysterious woman, and we decided we had to go find her. Lily is persistently asked why she is in Russia, and despite being an understandable question, it is both decidedly boring and difficult to answer. The implication being, I guess, why is it that you decide to move away from the greatest country on earth? She gets this question from both Russians and Americans. Lily struggles to answer this question. I studied Russian, she says. I like the architecture in St. Petersburg. The old ladies don't have any cellulite, though they are big-bellied. These answers are decidedly dissatisfying, and Lily is left feeling bored and boring. Laura got lucky, though. She fell in love. What a good answer.
Orlik, the one that Smith sat on today, was a stallion that was gifted to me on my 28th birthday by my husband, Igor. And that was the year that I first moved here to the village from Moscow, where I was working for World Wildlife Fund. And I had decided to come and try to explore the Russian countryside and work for the nature preserve here. And I think that was sort of his plot to get me to stay. I mean, what do? You give a young, 28-year-old a wild black stallion, and then, how's she going to say no to that?
In 1993, 2 years after graduating college, Laura took a job with the World Wildlife Fund. Tasked with setting up the organization's first office in Russia, Laura worked with Russian biologists and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment to determine how an international organization could help fund nature conservation locally. The slightly more aware version of why did you move to Russia is, of course, why did you choose to stay in Russia?
you ended up coming here at first before you were gifted the horse. You came down here, and what was your when did you realize that you were going to stay and
Yeah, for me,
be
it was
here?
just like a short term, oh, fun, let's go get immersed in, biology in the field and living in the Russian countryside in the village. Because most of the people I'd worked along with in Moscow had spent years, I mean, they were in like 40s and 50s, so they'd spent decades like out in the field and on expeditions and doing research. And, they were biologists in the true sense of the word. Not like often in our liberal arts education in the US. We know biology by a textbook and from a laboratory, but we don't have those years of field work under our belt. So I was really yearning for that. And so that really appealed to me to come and spend some time here. And of course, I didn't know it was a long-term thing. But, one thing led to the other. And my husband, Igor, who was not my husband at the time, he was the director of the nature reserve. And, we just fell in love, and then sort of one thing led to the other. And I've got a black stallion and a soon-to-be husband, and building a house together. So, yeah, I actually wrote a book, which I'll give you guys a postcard. It's called The Stork's Nest, Life and Love in the Russian Countryside. And it's about my first year in the village, and, going through the seasons and the living and the understanding of, wow, this is home.
During breakfast, Laura's husband and the world's foremost gift giver, Igor, briefly wanders into the kitchen. He's a wildlife photographer, tall, sinewy, handsome, and like Laura, looks healthy and younger than his age. Of course, I'm tempted to chalk their visible youth and health up to being people that have spent a couple decades eating vegetables and fruit grown in their own garden and spending time around horses, or maybe they just won some sort of genetic lottery. But I guess when I get home, I'm going to stop buying produce from the shitty Ideal food basket around the corner from my apartment and cave to my roommate who keeps making me go to the co-op. It's actually because of Igor that the Bryansky Reserve exists at all.
And that's always been his passion, is photography. And he grew up in this area and discovered the black stork here. No one before that knew that the black stork lived here, which is like the white stork, but it's black and it's smaller and it lives in very remote areas. It generally doesn't like to be near people, unlike the white stork. So it was virtually unheard of in this region, hadn't been seen. And at like 13, he happened upon a pair of storks and was amazed and then told some of his some ornithologists about it, and they hadn't even known that it lived here. So he spent the next, years of his life crisscrossing this forest and looking for every possible stork's nest that he could find and photographing it, and eventually lobbying for creation of a protected area to protect the forests where the black stork lives, because they nest in the same place year after year. And they build giant nests, they need big trees to support the nest. And big trees like that were becoming more and more rare with logging, with forestry, with draining the swamps, which made this area, which is a floodplain of the Desna River, it made this area more accessible. So he understood the urgency that was needed to create a preserve. And in 1984, he lobbied the regional government to create a local protected area. And then in 1987, the federal preserve was created.
After breakfast, we go to have our first session with the horses. I'm not going to tell you much about it now because we recorded the second session and we can tell you about that later.
There's 8 horses in Laura's herd, 7 horses and a pony, which is technically a horse. In the afternoon, we go on an expedition through the reserve with a biologist from the reserve, Oleg, a man in his late 50s with capped gold teeth who's very enthusiastic about the forest. I feel like people like that are the same in every country. Field biologist types that get really excited about the change in soil type or how mice hide their acorns. They are a comforting type of person. I say this to Smith and she agrees. A guy named Pavel, one of Oleg's students, is also on our expedition, and there is our driver, Vladimir, who is a ranger. I sit in the middle seat between Pavel and Oleg. Smith sits up front, and I translate most of what Oleg is saying. The Bryansky Les Reserve is 121.9 square kilometers. We travel perpendicularly away from the river, which in ancient times was much bigger, more like a floodplain. When it receded, it left these tiers of land, whose soil and fauna differ. You probably wouldn't notice this, though, if Oleg wasn't with you.
Где-то 15-17% территории страны составляют.
So the preserves only take up 2% of all Russian land, but most of the forests in Russia, most of the forests belong to the government except for a tiny percent, but most of it's used industrially.
Oh, so they do log most of it.
I guess so. I mean, there's a lot that they don't probably because there's so much land. Way more, way more than they would need. Every few minutes, Vladimir stops the car, and me, Smith, Pavel, and Oleg pile out of it. We walk a few meters into the woods, and Oleg explains, "This is where the mice live. This is where the birds tuck the acorns into the bark of the tree for the winter. This is where the soil goes from clay to sandy. This is a moose track. This is deer scat. This is where people used to farm using this ancient agricultural method that continued way longer here than in other parts of the world. This is where people used to graze their cattle."
Okay. Это летом бывало?
Ранней весной
Мгм.
и до поздней осени.
А потом они как-то их
А
собирали?
потом ходили, собрали, свое стадо забирали, привозили домой и убивали.
То есть это древний вид, этот скот, как вы сказали?
Скотоводство.
Скотоводство. Okay, so it consists of basically people in villages send their entire herd or whatever of cattle out into the woods from early spring until late fall, and they don't bother them at all, and then they somehow get them later and then kill them.
Они сами паслись, и хозяйка не волновала ничего.
And yeah, the owner wasn't worried about it. They were just like,
А потом, глубокой осени, она это искала. Это сохранилось до последнего времени.
до последнего, like now,
Да.
basically, till recently.
Oh, okay.
Как они нашли их, я не понимаю.
Но по следам.
Вообще
They followed their
коровы,
tracks.
по крайней мере, их же надо доить, чтобы у них там все нормально было, чтобы вымя не разорвало
Ага.
молока. Вот. Они, соответственно, днем пасутся, стадо ходит просто само по лесу, а вечером приходит на дойку в деревню.
Она может приходить, а еще есть коровы недойные. Запускается молоко.
Которые мясные, да?
Мясные, и все, не надо.
But if
Они-
the cow's a milk cow, then sometimes it comes back to be milked.
Вот.
But
И они
the
сами-
meat ones were just,
Те,
and
которые
they'd follow the
доятся, они
tracks.
идут домой. А те, которые не нужен доиться, они остаются ночевать в лесу. А к зиме уже хозяйка их забирает.
Mm-hmm.
По следам ищет. Ну и
Пальцем,
так
да.
часто они меня сопровождают. Когда я здесь что-то изучал,
Uh-huh.
коровы думали, что я хозяин, прибивались ко мне, это стадо, оно там пасется, а я тут изучаю.
So he was like sometimes studying and would come across like cattle or something, and they would think that he was the owner.
Если мне нужно перейти туда, я перехожу, и они переходят.
And they would follow him.
А потом они идут со мной на кордон туда, к домику, где я живу.
And they'd
вечером.
follow him towards his house at night
И там меня ждут до утра.
and wait for until the morning.
He picks up some moss and shows us a collection of acorns. Mice, he says. That's their food, Lily asks. Yes, says Oleg. She's storing food for winter, but she's gone now, killed. But we'll leave the food in case her relatives come back. He covers the acorns back up with the moss. Oleg shows us a lot of hidden acorns, conveniently located near the road. I start to suspect he put them there beforehand. Later at dinner, when I share this suspicion with Laura and Lily, Lily is shocked, but Laura confirms that it's true. An old-fashioned Russian word for driver is chauffeur, or chauffeur. Lily later says it's not commonly used in Petersburg, but Oleg uses it exclusively, and it's unclear if he's being ironic. Laura says it's a regular word. This part coming up is hard for the chauffeur, Oleg says. Hard? What's hard? Vladimir says as he drives easily in the Land Rover over ill-maintained roads. It's very hard for the chauffeur, says Oleg. Vladimir stops the car and we all pile out.
Выходим, у нас экскурсия по плану.
This time, Vladimir too.
Бардак был полный.
Бардак, значит,
Бардак был полный.
бардак.
Типа не было хозяина?
Не было хорошего хозяина.
Ага.
Oleg shows us a blue wooden post off the road. He says in Tsarist times the land was divided into quadrants, and there are these posts marking the corner where quadrants meet. On each side of the post is painted the number of that side's respective quadrant. Surveying the reserve, before it was a reserve, started in Tsar's time. Every 20 years, the posts marking the corner of 4 quadrants are replaced to keep them fresh.
Ну и
This could
каждые
go
20
anywhere, but
лет
this is-
заповедники меняются, столбы такие. Каждые 20
Every
лет
20 years they change the sky.
на остров, да. Каждые 20 лет меняются эти столбы.
Да,
Ясно?
да,
Ну
сказала.
вот, и обязательно было такое правило, что столбы кладутся
Да.
на
Старый столб
месте.
остается на месте.
А.
Новый устанавливают.
Но наши инспектора
Да.
прошлый столб куда-то
Но
дели.
они лесниками не
There's a
работают.
tradition that this is supposed to stay on the place where
Олег
it was.
Иванович,
Okay.
есть у нас надзорная, так сказать, организация, Росприроднадзор. И вот если окрашенная
Что-то будет в лесу.
древесина, это уже загрязнение первой категории. За это на организацию, на юридическое лицо выписываются штрафы. Очень
Basically, the inspector took
Нельзя
away the last
оставлять.
one because it was,
Крашеные.
потому что
старые
крашеный.
столбы
А раньше
нельзя оставлять.
оставляли, вот.
Ну, это лесники оставляли.
Вот.
Вот он.
They used to leave them right near. That's the tradition. But then now they're like, oh, it's painted. You can't leave it in the last year,
Оставляли
last 20
доказательство
years,
того,
last time.
что как
The
бы
inspector
заменили,
took it
да.
away because he was like, last
А
time.
вот до этого...
He's
Это
sad.
сосновые
And he's like,
делали,
and then he was
уже в
explaining the like
заповеднике.
complicated rule. He was like, according to like article blah 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 or whatever about the first category, you can't leave paint in the ground because it's like toxic. Yeah, the point is, but you can't get the paint off them because they're like weatherproof, and then
Там будет экзамен, там еще столько мы остановимся, и был экзамен, куда идти к Лоре.
хорошо,
Хорошо?
готовы. He's like, there's gonna be an exam, and when we an exam at the next one, we have to know where to go.
We get back in the car. This part of the road is hard for the chauffeur, Oleg says. Hard? Why hard? Vladimir says. We hit a puddle. See, it's very hard for the chauffeur, says Oleg. Halfway through the expedition, Lily tries to poison me. We've been going for a couple of hours, and we haven't slept much on the train. We've been eating berries along the way.
Blueberry. Yeah, that's a blueberry.
Русский голубика.
Голубика. Ага, видишь? Ну, можно
You
есть.
can eat it.
Да.
Да, давай.
They said you could, so you can.
Ну, загадывай желание. Наверное, первый раз это
You need to make a
ягода.
wish. Quickly. Okay, she
Когда
did.
первый раз ягоду ешь в году, то можно загадывать желание.
А.
А в жизни так вообще все исполняется. Ну, вот если первый раз в жизни ела ягоду, а вон.
He said the first time that you eat a berry in the year, you can make a
А
wish.
это другая
And if it's the first
ягода.
time in your life, then it will definitely come true.
Вот это тоже можно еще загадать желание. Два желания тут
Oh, 2 wishes are here. I'm eating this.
есть. Загадывай желание.
Я загадала.
Там, не знаю.
Make some wishes, Missy.
Oleg or Pavel will tell us if the berries are edible. On one of our little walks in the woods, I ask, "Is this edible?" Lily asks Oleg. Oleg says a word, and Lily turns to me and says, "Yes, it's edible." I raise the berry with glee and pop it into my mouth. Pavel and Oleg start yelling, "No, no, no!" After that, Pavel and Oleg tell me every time we see a berry if I can eat it or not. I start side-eyeing Lily. On one of our little walks in the woods, Oleg tells us the story about wine production in the forest. Well, not wine, but I guess at the time they called all alcohol wine.
Oh, okay. We get to hear the ancient story of this village. These forests belong to the Tsar.
И царь здесь держал.
Okay, and the Tsar had like a factory basically that made. Это какого века?
Это
From the 17th to the 19th, different czars. Okay, so the Tsar, like the person, the Tsar, had a factory that did like spirits, hard alcohol.
здесь сюда крестьяне привозили зерно, картофель, свеклу.
Okay, so like the peasant people, workers would bring zerno, что
Ну,
еще?
хлеб.
Yeah,
Пшеница.
seeds, yeah, different grains, potatoes, and
свекла, бурак.
beets. And then a lot of logs to heat it there, fire.
Тут испарялись спирты, вино.
Okay, and then you
Ну
get
вот.
the
И нужно,
infusion
чтобы
of-
было охлаждалось. И почему и все заводы стояли.
He's like, the men live separately in like Chukareyo over there, and there was women who ran this, and the men wouldn't drink it. And they were like the main economic fuel for the government.
Whoa.
Да, как сейчас на нефти, так и на газе, так тогда спирт был, за счет спирта валюту получали.
Wow. He's like just the same way that now it's like you get
Ну,
the
и
government
царь
gets
заботился,
for
чтобы не
cash for
спились
oil.
много.
At that time it was for alcohol. But it's like yeah, pure alcohol. Like vodka.
Конкретно здесь, который был заводик.
В
Oh,
заводе,
this
когда-
particular. Okay, so like the flower started to realize that those factories weren't that like efficient or something, but this particular one was sold to a poet, or no, he rented it or something and then made money from it and wrote a bunch of poetry.
But not
Как
a
его зовут?
famous
Тютчев.
poet.
Тютчев.
Ну,
And not
наверное,
famous
не
enough
слышали.
for...
Чистые поэты мы называем их.
Надо
Я не
посмотреть.
Ну да. Он в Брянской области жил, поэтому.
Там, Брянск.
Вот и литературная Брянщина.
Да.
Литературная Россия.
Вообще.
Спирт гнал Тютчев. Самый наш любимый поэт Брянской области, России.
He's the favorite
Гнал
Russian poet of
спирт.
Bryansk.
Ну, то есть это...
Praying mantis. Mantis.
О, это богомол.
Да.
Повезло. Богомол.
Ну, вспышка
Что-то
богомола.
случилось с крылья, нет?
Нет,
Всё
нет,
нормально.
это он такой вот и есть.
Oh, wait, I have to take a picture.
Bogomol.
What's the
Yeah,
Russian
yeah,
word for it?
Bogom. It's like God
Как
praying.
бы молится.
And we say praying mantis.
Это такое
What is a
степное
mantis?
животное, то есть он в лугах, в степях.
He's also steppe. Hi, buddy.
We stopped for a snack of cookies, salami, cheese, bread, and mint tea Laura gave us a thermos of, steeped from mint freshly picked from her garden. By this point, Lily and I have reached hysteria from lack of sleep. Lily's been translating nonstop for hours. She shows me a picture of deer poop she took at Oleg's insistence earlier on her phone, and we both lose it. Lily goes to the bathroom to cool down, and I sit with the fellas and eat my cookie. We see some bison, and everyone else in the car sees a moose, but I miss it because Lily made a joke and I was laughing with my head back. We get back to Laura's after dark. We have some banya time and then eat with Laura in the house and go to bed.
The next day, we have our second session with the horses. This one we recorded. In the corral, there's a bunch of objects. Plastic rings, a giant spool that maybe had rope or wire wrapped around it, a hall runner, Tibetan prayer flags, wooden paddles. For our first exercise, Laura tells us to build a representation of our lives using the objects. The gate to the corral is open, and the horses are gathered around curiously.
You've created an object or a projection of your life here. So let me know what objects you've selected and why, and how is this a representation of you?
Yeah, I just was trying to be intuitive, so I just like looked at the collection and the carpet. It was like in that blurred sort of that intuitive type of vision when you're looking at something and then one thing stands out, and that was the carpet. And I laid it out at first straight. Hi, Margot.
Margot is a Percheron, a French draft horse. She's giant and glossy black. Throughout the session, she's insistent on participating, standing in the middle of our group of three at all times, stepping on some of the objects, knocking them over slowly.
And when I put it out, I realized it looked too sort of direct, like a boat or something, or like a red carpet. And I was like, this can't be right. So I curved the carpet a little bit so that it wasn't so rigidly straight.
Lily explains her choices for each object. Mostly she chooses things for their aesthetic quality. Margot begins to destroy the arrangement.
This is more representing my life. Everything I planned is being destroyed.
So what the fact that the horses now are coming in and adding their own piece to it, right? They're destroying things, they're knocking things over, they're playing with things. Even your nice straight rug that you've played out is now becoming a toy for Fable. And Daisy also, when she came in, the first thing she did was she stepped on the beginning of this. What is this in your life? What is this rug?
It's a good question. I mean,
I'm going to pause here for a moment because I think it's important for me to explain something about mine and Lily's personalities. Though Lily can't help running her mouth about how she feels, and I am at times very sensitive, neither of us is particularly sentimental. Neither of us has ever been to therapy, except one time my mom made me go to a child shrink when I was in first grade, I think because I was shy. And for a short period of time, Lily was forced to see the school therapist in high school because she was hanging out with some bad influence kids who bought beer and then got caught by the police. But We don't talk about mindfulness or inner truth. Neither of us meditates, and I don't think either of us would ever describe an experience as powerful. This is all to say that we are probably not ideal candidates for equine-assisted learning. However, we both made a genuine effort to be open. When Laura asked us that first breakfast what we wanted to get out of it, Lily, ever the capitalist, said she wanted to really try to buy into the experience, and I agreed. So when Laura asks how Lily feels about the horse disrupting the representation of her life, Lily's trying.
What is this in your life? What is this rug?
It's a good question. I mean, if it, like, I was trying not to think too much about what it is as I was doing it, so I could get sort of an intuitive feeling. And if it's anything, I guess, like, well, I think one thing is about the straight line is it felt very, like, deliberate. Like, I know where the beginning is and I know where the end is. And that is something that I really shy away from, having too sort of far in advance plans or knowing exactly how something is going to progress. I don't like that. So I think if I'm interpreting my own symbolism here, a straight line seems too obvious or something. And I needed to, like, curve the carpet so that, like, I wouldn't want to know exactly where it's going to end. So I almost like that they did this.
So you made the curve thinking, almost like a path, right? That I don't want it to be so straight and narrow. I want it to curve.
Yeah.
And I want there to be something out there that's the unknown.
Right.
Which is now being, explored.
Moved.
Explored and moved even further out by fable. And then the Tower of Progress. Like, they just stuck up everything like a...
Phallus.
Yeah. Phallus. Your word, not mine.
Yeah,
but, mine. And then Margot came and just, like, knocked it over.
She did.
So what's the Tower of Progress in all of this? It's sort of on the side, and it looks very different than the rest of the objects to me.
Yeah, it does stand out.
What does that represent for you?
I don't know.
Progress.
Oh my God, what is that progress?
You, just you.
Maybe something that I made. Unfortunately, it has to be tall and vertical, like everything that humans make. I don't know why.
So something that you might make, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something that I might make.
Or that sticks out, that stands out, right?
Yeah,
Is it tall and vertical, or is it more something that's noticeable and sticks out?
Maybe that's what the vertical, maybe that's why people build things that are tall and vertical, because they stick out. But yeah, like something that...
Watch out.
Girl. She really likes to be right in the middle.
Yeah.
Good girl.
All right, so great. So Smith, tell us about your creation here and why you chose which objects.
I'm not mic'd, so I'll just explain to you here. I made a small packed arrangement with a wooden spool at the center representing my mother and my aunts and my cousins and siblings.
This was really interesting for me to, like, go first and then hear Smith's, because it's so different from mine. Like, when you gave this assignment, sort of like whatever,
Offer. I call it
an offer to represent your life, like, Smith makes her family in this compact pattern, and I only think of myself. I like there's only me in that picture. Like, there's no other people. It's just like the thing I made, the path I'm on, some pretty thing I like. Like, it's really different. And also I covered more space and had more chaos, and, like, as you said, it was more about a flow rather than, like, a construction. And I don't know, I don't necessarily have, like, analyses for that I can say right now, but the difference is really striking to me. I'm still thinking about it.
Talking about your family is deceptive because it appears as if you're talking about yourself, but you're not actually. It's maybe more of a deflective tactic than a reflection of how much I outwardly versus inwardly orient my sense of self. Laura asks us questions about our relationship. We've been friends a long time, I say. It's an intense relationship, says Lily. I say that sometimes we communicate too much, or maybe we don't, which means I don't know what. Lily says she wants us to have more respect for each other's individualism, which means she wants me to stop trying to control her. She pats Margot, who is standing between us, and is so big we can't see each other, and says, like a positive distance, like Margot. I agree and start thinking about how we can get our hands on a draft horse. After the couple's therapy session, I lay on a horse, Orlik. Orlik is the stallion that Igor gifted Laura all those years ago. Lily holds the lead rope. I close my eyes and don't think about anything. Lily had been talking about getting to lay or be on a horse all day, yammering in my ear about how excited she was. But Laura phrased this offering, like, now both of you are going to get a helmet and one of you is going to get on the horse. And in the moment, Lily handed me the riding helmet. Laura was surprised.
I missed that moment, obviously, because I was like, oh, you're getting on the horse. So how did that come about? And, was it different than you might normally do things? Or what surprised you about that whole interaction?
I mean, it was different than what we would normally do, but it didn't particularly surprise me that we would do it a different way.
Oh, whoa, what was that?
Or her tail just hit.
Oh.
You wanted to do the non-obvious.
Not just for the sake of doing the opposite of what's obvious, because that's sort of like, well, whatever, just for the sake of the opposite. It was more just like, I just didn't want to be like, well, maybe it is the sake of being opposite. How do I explain this? I just, like, I wanted to be on the horse. I knew that, and you knew that, and we all knew that. And everyone was like, okay, so now, but it's because of how you phrased it. It's like you said,
You decide.
you said, like, you're going to decide, one of you is going to put the helmet on and get on the horse, or some words like that, like that we were going to decide. So rather than saying like, okay, so like, Lily, you're going to go get on the horse. And I realized, like, okay, in this moment, I know Smith also wants to go on the horse. And the opportunity was kind of presented to, like, let her.
In the evening, Sasha drives us to Suzemka to catch the train back to Moscow. We eat salad and soup at a dark cafe whose only other patrons are teens who are drinking Coke in the corner of another dark room where there's a stage and a disco ball that's on. They keep disappearing to the bathroom and not returning. The lone server, who stays in the back room behind the bar as much as possible, almost fully ignores our existence. But eventually I order and we eat. Suzemka is this small town, bigger than a village, but definitely not a city, with a population of about 9,000. It has one main road that curves through the city where all the shops are, Sasha tells us as we drive through. The cafe is across from the train station. Weirdly, on two different sides of this small city are the same few chain stores, repeated. After dinner, we go to one of them, a familiar Dixie glowing in the dark, to get chocolate for the train ride. On the trip back to Moscow, we're in the Platzkart with everyone and their brother. We share our quad with two babushki. I'm overheating and fanning myself with my hand after we bustle into the train car. I'm panicking that there's no AC in this car. "Take off your sweater, dear," says one of the babushki. "You're just a little warmed up from walking here. You'll cool off soon." "Don't be shy," says the other, as I start struggling to get my sweater over my head without my shirt coming off with it. We're all girls here. They chat amongst themselves. They both happen to be from Moldova. The older one tells us about Moldova basically with tears in her eyes, about how the sun is always shining there and all her friends and smiling neighbors are there. She's on her way back. She was visiting her hometown, but she's sad here in Russia. The other one mentions some acquaintances she has in New York, in Brooklyn. She tries to remember the exact street address. She remembers it, and I repeat it to Smith, and we both nod and say, "Ah, okay," but we don't know where it is at all. The older lady goes to the bathroom, and the younger one tells me quietly in my ear that actually she's heading to Moscow to then fly to New York because she's found work there with a family, through her friend. She said she didn't want to tell the older one. She says I understand, don't I? She doesn't want to make her feel bad, so please don't tell her. I say of course I understand and that I'm happy for her. One of them gives us homemade Neapolitan cake. Maybe the Platzkart isn't so bad.
A very special thanks to Laura for welcoming us into her home so fully, Igor for not seeming to mind our presence in his home, Oleg, Pavel, and Vladimir for showing us the reserve, and Sasha for driving us to and fro.